Dujek One Arm and his army awaited the arrival of Caladan Brood and his allies, the Fell Teist Andi, Barghast clans from the far north, a half-score mercenary contingents, and the plains-dwelling Rivi. There, on the still, raw killing ground, outside the city of Pale, the two forces would meet, not to wage war, but to carve from bitter history peace. Neither Dujek, nor Brood, nor anyone else among their legendary company could have anticipated the ensuing clash, not of swords, but of worlds.
What up, and welcome back to another Malazan Book of the Fallen video. This is Memories of Ice, Chapter 3. I know it's been a while, but I didn't forget about you. Let's get into it. As usual, we're going to do non-spoilery summary analysis and then spoilery goodness at the end, and I'll clearly demarcate when you need to jump out. That being said, this is awesome because those first two chapters on the prologue were really, I felt like, just introduction, and now we're starting to get into the meat of setting up the kind of major arcs and conflicts that we're going to be investigating throughout the rest of the books. Before we get into all of that stuff, we should probably go through just some like basic refresher material. So we'll do a little bit of catching up. Meet me over on my iPhone. Okay, so the Maibi is the Rivi Plains woman that Krupp, the elder god Krull, and then Pran Cole, who's the IMAS Bonecaster, who they all put that weird little soul-shifted Tattersail, Night Chill, soul demon baby thing into her belly in Krupp's dream back during like the first third of Gardens of the Moon. Pran Cole is himself that Bonecaster from the prologue of Memories of Ice that was like hunting those kids at the beginning. So easy. Okay, so now that we got that part straight, we basically pick up with the Maibi, who's like in some ways living through a literal interpretation of like the metaphorical process of motherhood, where she's like literally dumping everything she has emotionally and physically into this child who's like literally, consuming the mother, and kind of killing her off because of just this insatiable growth that she's experiencing, which is all coming basically from the life force of her mom. And the Maibi is such a sad storyline because, you know, this poor Maibi is keeping a positive attitude or trying to put the kid first, but she blames herself and in some ways looks at what's happening to her as like a punishment, right? And internalizes it, and it's just really pretty sad.
I think someone needs a hug.
And you see that kind of inner conflict play out in her internal monologue, right? Because on the one hand, she is, loving and caring, and on the other hand, she's like kind of scared and bitter and resentful that she's dying, specifically because of her investment in this child. And what makes us feel for her so much as the readers is that this isn't a thing, a self-inflicted wound, right? This is literally the consequence of her being used and abused by, gods who are trying to take control of or influence events and are using her as a vehicle by which to do that, and she has to live the consequence. And actually, shout out to Erickson for trying to explore the process of motherhood and whatever. It's pretty gnarly to think about, and I look at my wife and kids and stuff with a new respect, because in some ways that is kind of what it seems like, is that just putting everything and being in some ways consumed by just the job that is being a parent. Then we pick up with Corlat, who is a dope character, Tistandi, black skin badass, who's Animander Rake's second in command, and she helps to kind of give us some backstory or contextualize what's all happening there, because we learn that Silver Fox is a source of conflict within Brood's camp, especially with Calor, which then pits him against the Mybi, and not knowing ultimately where Kaladin Brood's going to shake out on the question if it ever gets to, comes to a head. And the Mybi's aware of this, right? Because she says that, Brood has kind of been in her back pocket in some ways because he's needed the Rivi Plains tribes up to this point for their military efforts, right? And so there's a whole strategic alliance with the Rivi and Kaladin Brood, but now that he's linking up with Dujek and that immediate threat's going away, maybe he doesn't need the Rivi anymore, which then, creates this kind of vulnerability for her and for her daughter. And then we get the ultimate bombshell drop that Silver Fox isn't just the combination of like Tattersail and Nightchill, but she's also an IMAS Bonecaster, soul taken because of the ritual that Pran Cole put her through, when they were putting her all into the Mybi's belly and Krup's dream. That was all happening under the influence of his Talon Warren, and so now she's like a flesh and blood Bonecaster. With this bombshell, they're trying to connect the dots or wonder what it might mean. And is this why, like, the Talon IMAS have now bailed out on the Empire that they used to be allies with? But we don't get to delve into that too much, because then the focus turns to this parlay, and both sides are ultimately still suspicious, right? This is still like a tenuous alliance because they were literally just recently scrapping. Now Dujek is outlawed, and so Silver Fox talks about how she's kind of like the bridge of the ancient wars with the IMAS and the more modern wars of today, with Dujek going up against Brood and her being Tattersail and all of that stuff. But she even says, look, we've all, even though we were on different sides of this conflict, we were all going through the same conflict, the battles, the wins, the losses, we all lost people, etc. And just kind of makes the bigger overarching point, I think, which is a broader point of the whole books, which is that all these races, as different as they are, what we learn is that they're all basically, at the end of the day, more or less human. And this is all happening as kind of Dujek finally is showing up. And what we see is from basically Jump Street that Corlat is like thirsting for Whiskey Jack.
Oh, well, besides the fact that he's totally hot?
Then we kind of get Silver Fox like sizing up the whole contingent, right? She likes Whiskey Jack. She's like confused or suspicious of the aide Artanos. We get our Kaladin Brood kind of sitting there with the big old hammer. We get Calor in his long chainmail looking cranky as ever. Apparently he's their like tactical military strategy genius. He's sitting there looking all smug, like not really anybody on their side likes him. We get word that the Crimson Guard, who had been with Brood this whole time, have now bailed, so they're not going to be part of the alliance. We also get to see, as they cruise through the camp, some of these Tistandi soldiers who are just like all depressed and sad. It's like they're super G'd up warriors and whatnot, but they're not fighting for their own cause. They're fighting for somebody else and just not really animated or fired up. And it's just kind of like them, resisting the Empire on the basis of it being the right thing to do back in Gardens of the Moon. And that's kind of, they're just carrying it on. There's no like fire in their belly. Sad. But then we get to the command tent, and that is where stuff really starts to heat up and where we start to get the foundations of some of the conflict that is coming to the fore in the rest of the book. And everybody's just in there sizing each other up, right? Can we trust each other? Like, what are your motivations? They're like doing the visual sizing up and down, right? They're busting out the tape measures, all of that stuff. We get Crone, who tries to like make a wise crack to Dujek one arm, and we get Whiskey Jack, who clowns her back instead. It's pretty hilarious. Silver Fox talks about knowing Crone's like whole backstory, and Crone's like, yo, zip it for your own good and for mine. So something's up there. And then we also get this whole story of the table, right? Because Whiskey Jack asks Brood where he got this table, and for me that's like the best story because it perfectly encapsulates both the Mott irregulars as well as the bridge burners, and in particular the sappers, right? Because they're just like, you can imagine there's like this whole war going on. Meanwhile, you have these two little groups within the broader armies that are like fighting over this table, like 300-pound table back and forth, so that they can have like this giant card game in the middle of the war. During this meeting, what we see is that Tattersail starts to kind of come to the fore, if you will, of Silver Fox. Whiskey Jack kind of recognizes her a little bit. He's not really sure how, but there's definitely some kind of a connection there. They bust out all the maps and start talking tactics and strategy, and the bottom line there is that everything is pointing towards this kind of Panian Seers forces poised to lay siege to the city of Kapustan, which is like a city-state basically on Genabakis, and they have relatively good defenses. They have a mercenary company there, and so chances are they can hold out, so they can kind of use that as a rallying point to go there and have this kind of full frontal assault with the Panian Seers army. And there's a whole kind of political dynamic which takes up a big part of the chapter, but just basically describing the internal politics of this city Kapustan, where you have this kind of dichotomy between the high priests of all the religious cults, holding power, as well as a kind of prince, a kind of royal, regent figure or whatever, who runs things on his end. They've got him by law mandated to keep a small force of, military force, and they have their own unlimited forces. So there's the religious army and then a kind of civil army, if you will. And so there's conflict there. That's why actually the prince had to bring in the mercenary company, the Grey Swords, who are apparently super badass and cost even more than the Crimson Guard. But that's basically the backdrop of what's happening, right? Is that they have their own internal shenanigans going on, and that Dujek and Brood both see that as the place where they're going to go and take on the Panian Seer. We also hear a little bit about the Panian Seer's forces, and particularly the Ten Scoury, who are like no-holds-barred army of peasants that he raised up and just said, do whatever you have to do to win. There is nothing against the law that you're doing. And so they straight up to, one of the ways they feed themselves is by cannibalizing their armies that they walk all over. They kill them and then they eat them. But the worst part is they're apparently doing even worse stuff than that. And so they all agree that this is kind of the be-all, end-all where they're going to go and take on this Panian Daemon. So they're doing all the military stuff, but then the attention quickly shifts over to Silver Fox, and Calor makes it clear, like, he hates Silver Fox, right? He says she's an abomination, that they should kill her. He spills the beans that she's killing the Mybi, that she's like sucking the life force out of the Mybi, and the Mybi's pissed because she hadn't been telling her. Silver Fox didn't know, and then she's like crushed to realize that her like exponential growth is coming at the cost of her mother's well-being. Whiskey Jack tells him to shut up. Calor threatens Silver Fox and makes some kind of comment, and Whiskey Jack just straight up backhands the out of Calor, like snaps his head back, bleeding, everything. It was great. But then Silver Fox basically lets the cat out of the bag on her lineage and is like, yeah, I'm an Imass Bonecaster, and I'm here for this kind of second coming of the Talon Imass, and I'm going to be commanding this new army of whatever Imass are still out there. And that because of this kind of ritual where she went through with Talon and became a real flesh and blood Bonecaster, soul taken, whatever, that's how she kind of got the reins, because now she's the only living Bonecaster out there. And we also get some Whiskey Jack like internal monologue during this time, which hints at the idea that the outlawing of Dujak's army might not be totally legit. He also kind of like makes some googly eyes at Corlat that makes you think he's probably thirsting for a little bit of the pleasures of the flesh himself. We also get a lot happens during this tent meeting, but we get some foreshadowing from Crone, who talks about their true nature and how if everybody found out where they came from, that they, for some reason, would be at odds with Anomander Rake, because they were kind of there at the chaining of the Crippled God originally, and were like kind of born of his flesh and are therefore the custodians of his magic. And so therefore maybe that would set him in conflict with Anomander Rake. We get some backstory too on Kaladin Brood, who apparently leveled an entire mountain with his hammer. So just establishing the kind of badassness of Kaladin Brood. We get a lot of the Talon Imas backstory as well. And a lot of it kind of ties in with some of the stuff that we saw in the prologue, which talks about this never-ending war and the need to be able to circumvent the kind of requirement for sustenance or, inability to cross, glaciers with no wildlife and still sustain an army, or, follow across oceans without giant ships and all of that stuff, and how this ritual was all based in their never-ending war against the Jagut, and how the undead becoming zombies was a way to circumvent the need for food, resources, limitations on transportation, all of that. And it kind of rounds out with Whiskey Jack wondering, and Silver Fox too, like, what's up when Gano shows up, because they used to be a thing. Now she's a 9-year-old girl. At the end, we kind of get Whiskey Jack having a little powwow with Corlat. They talk about Silver Fox. She confirms the kind of backstory on the Great Ravens, that they were like born of the festering flesh of this crippled god that they brought down to try and harness the power from the prologue. They talk about how Silver Fox is really the only thing like wrecking this alliance, right? Because she's the only source of conflict both within Brood's army and also now because Whiskey Jack slapped the shit out of Calor between the two groups too, and the need kind of therefore to protect Silver Fox, because Brood has other priorities, shall we say. And again, we talked about that earlier in the video. And so they kind of make some compacts. They also make a bunch of googly eyes again at each other. And so the heart palpitations are definitely happening. I think I'm going to leave this one there for the analysis. I was going to do 3 and 4, but I think this one was so chunky that we're just going to do 3 and then I'll do 4. So if you don't want any spoilers, now's your chance to jump out. Thanks for watching. We'll see you with chapter 4 very soon. Already have it planned out. Just need to record it after this one. The other reason why I wanted to cut that one short there too is because there's so much spoilery stuff that happens here in this 3rd chapter, again, as the foundations get laid for the whole plot, that I wanted to have a decent chunk of time to get the conversation going for the Discord or the comments or whatever. One of the questions I wanted to ask is just, on that Felis and Mybe thing, right? Because which one is the more sympathetic character? I feel like there's a lot less hate for the Mybe than there is for Felisin, even though they both go through like really time, right? They're both just getting swept up in events that are bigger than themselves, right? That men and gods are taking advantage of them for their own selfish purposes. And, Felisin and the Mybe, I guess, the Mybe gets the happy ending, quote unquote, but I would argue maybe even the Felisin ending was better, is just to straight up die after going through all that versus going into a kind of dream state just to get some finality to it ultimately. I think in some ways the ending of Memories of Ice was more about like establishing the creds for Hood and whatnot than it was about giving the Mybe a happy ending, honestly. But showing that the God of Death is this empathetic character and whatnot. But curious to know what you think about the Felisin Mybe comparison. Also, point of clarification, education for me is like, how does Pran Cole's ritual mean that Silver Fox is a soul taken? I know you guys have said that every Bonecaster was soul taken, but I just don't get how the ritual, because there's all these other soul taken and Deavers and stuff that didn't go through Pran Cole's Talon ritual. And so how, what's going on with that? The other thing is, I think like the cool thing about these books is like is the Mybe storyline, right? I think it's like a perfect example of how the books aren't like about empathy and compassion necessarily, although if you read the end of the Crippled God, it arguably is about being empathetic and compassionate, but I think that the bigger point is that you like empathize with these characters. You can put yourself in these shoes because of the way the books are written. And I don't know if that's a personality predisposition, as I mentioned in the collab, or not, but here I am, this like 40-year-old fat white bald dude, and thinking about like the journey of motherhood and the investment that it takes and what it does to your physical and mental health and all of that stuff. And, I would say that's one of the gems of the books, as I've said many times, that emotional side. Because even though it's fantastical, even though it's something totally not kind of day-to-day life relevant for me, I'll never be a mom, I'll never have to like breastfeed and all of that stuff. It's like you're thinking about stuff and taking it back to real life and looking at like your relationships and your appreciation for people. Also, I want you to get your take on what the deal is with Silver Fox's whole speech about having to deny forgiveness, and whether that's like foreshadowing. Is that Nightchill saying that she's not going to forgive Calor? It's kind of opaque. Or is it, foreshadowing of her not redeeming or not forgiving the IMAS later on and leaving it for Ithkovian to be the redeemer, because, arguably Silver Fox could have been the one to do that. I'm curious about what you think about her speech in chapter 3 as it pertains to that kind of final moments. We also see Artan, the standard bearer, for the first time, and we never even connect the dots all along that he was like Dujek's shaved knuckle in the hole, even with all the breadcrumbs that have been laid like as early on as Gardens of the Moon, end of Gardens of the Moon, but definitely in Deadhouse Gates, that the whole outlawing thing is a sham. If we would have read Knight of Knives, he was calling himself Artanos at that time, so that would have been a dead giveaway, and why I think noobs should not read chronologically, in addition to just tone shift and all of that, and it's just one big book of the Fallen. But yeah, that was pretty cool to see that end game foreshadowed there. But for Silver Fox, she sees him for exactly who he is. There's like an uncertainty there, right? And so I don't know if this is Tattersail or Nightchill or both, being kind of, no one's ever sure about Tayshren's motivations and just calling him a chimera. And really that was warranted, right? Because by the end, he's like on this bigger quest that by the end of the Ice books culminates in him becoming this kind of elder god, but it wasn't totally clear that he was ride or die Empire. Like it was always, more existential, I think, for him than anything else. I love how Twist is with him at the meeting. I wonder, like, was he on a horse or what? We also see Outrider Hurlukel, or whatever his name is, who is the author of so many of those awesome poems and epigraphs that come at the start of so many of the chapters. There's also the kind of foreshadowing or the kicking off of the whole Crimson Guard storyline that starts off in Return of the Crimson Guard and continues on all the way through Assail, because they're basically bailing on Kaladin Brood to go back to this kind of second gathering, and culminates in Assail. We get endgame previews with Crone and the Great Ravens, and having come out of the flesh and then eventually going back into the flesh. A lot of foreshadowing. I totally forgot about the fact that the Grey Swords are like twice as expensive as the Crimson Guard. That's like a real feather in the cap. Poor Brucalian. I also love how Silver Fox calls out Whiskey Jack for kind of playing coy, like, oh, are we going to save Kapustan? Or what do you guys think? When it was really their plan all along, and how it kind of foreshadows a little bit how they were pretending to be outlawed, even though it was a ploy to bring Brood and Animander Rake and all that into the fold, which I thought was a cool, nice touch. We get Artan almost letting the cat out of the bag when Silver Fox is describing all the stuff that Tool and Lorne did and all of that with Tattersail and Nightchill, because he like recognizes and like gasps or something. Almost blew up his own spot. And then just in kind of the spirit of one of the latest videos questioning some of the logical elements of all this is, why the Silver Fox and the Mybe are like the Rivi Plains representatives in all these command meetings. She's like the source of all the conflict between the armies and within, honestly. So like, why is she even there in the first place, right? Why wasn't it one of the like tribal chiefs or the shaman or something like that of the Rivi? That's potentially an area of contrivance for plot, for kind of plot convenience. I don't know. Prove me wrong. Love to hear what you think. But yeah, I'll leave the spoiler stuff there. Hopefully that gets the conversation going. I love this chapter. There was so much of the conflict for the rest of the book set up in this one. There was a lot of foreshadowing of later in this book, and also for the whole 10-book series. And so that's why I was going to do 2 chapters in one, but 3 and 4 are both chunky. So we're going to break them up in 2, and I'll try and release them back to back. So thanks for watching. Hope you liked it. Like, subscribe, Patreon, Discord, merch, a partridge in a pear tree, what have you. And until next time, happy reading.